A girl revealed to the billionaire that his wife was not dead. Shocking secrets changed everything forever. A story that will move you. Subscribe, leave your like, and comment where you are watching from. The Central Park emerged through the morning mist of New York, like a sanctuary of marble and melancholy, where the most illustrious New Yorkers rested eternally under the protection of sculpted angels and memorials that rivaled small cathedrals. Among the geometrically perfect pathways, lined with century-old cypress trees, whispering secrets to the wind, Edward Morgan walked with measured steps, carrying a bouquet of daisies, Helen's favorites. At 52, Edward maintained the upright posture and imposing presence that made him a respected figure in the New York real estate market. His graying hair, always impeccably styled, framed a face marked by determination, but also by the weight of 15 years of mourning. The tailored Italian suit, always in sober tones, completed the image of a man who had built an empire based on precision and absolute control over every detail. "Dad, are you okay?" asked Sophie, his 17-year-old daughter, walking beside him with the natural grace of someone who had inherited her mother's classic beauty, but also the penetrating intensity of her father's gaze. Her long brown hair danced gently with the morning breeze, and her green eyes, identical to Helen's, carried a precocious maturity forged by maternal absence. "I'm always fine when I come to talk to your mother," Edward replied, his deep voice echoing among the funeral monuments. 15 years, Sophie. 15 years, and I still feel like it was yesterday." Helen Morgan's grave stood out even amid the opulence of that sacred place. The Carrara marble, specially imported from Italy, reflected the golden light of the rising sun, while the sculpture of a guardian angel, with details so delicate they seemed to breathe, eternally watched over the memory of the woman Edward had considered his soulmate. "Helen, my love," Edward murmured, kneeling before the tombstone and placing the flowers with the same reverential care as always. "I brought your favorites. The daisies in the garden are blooming again, just as you loved." Sophie is preparing for the medical school entrance exam. She has a generous heart, always thinking of helping others. Sophie watched her father with a mix of tenderness and concern. Those weekly rituals, maintained religiously for a decade and a half, were simultaneously touching and unsettling. Edward had turned that moment into an absolute necessity, as if Helen could truly hear him across the insurmountable barrier of death. "Dad, maybe we should talk about—" Sophie began delicately, but was interrupted by the sound of hurried footsteps echoing through the pathways. A girl of about 12 came running between the cypress trees, her worn sneakers making noise against the polished stone floor. She wore a simple t-shirt and faded jeans, drastically contrasting with the solemnity of the environment. Her curly hair was tied in 2 braids adorned with colorful ribbons, and her brown eyes sparkled with a determination that seemed disproportionate to her age. Mr. Edward Morgan," the girl shouted, running towards them, breathless. Edward stood up abruptly, instinctively positioning himself between the stranger and Sophie, his eyes narrowed with the natural distrust of someone who had learned to question the motives of anyone approaching his family. "Who are you?" he asked in a firm but not aggressive voice. "How do you know my name?" The girl stopped in front of them, panting, her hands trembling as she held a small, faded backpack against her chest. Her eyes filled with tears, but her voice remained surprisingly steady. "My name is Yasmin Smith, sir. My mother worked at your house many years ago. She told me things about Mrs. Helen." Sophie and Edward exchanged intrigued glances. The name Smith did not immediately evoke memories for Edward, who had kept distant relationships with most domestic staff over the years. "What kind of things?" Sophie asked, her natural curiosity overcoming her father's caution. Yasmin opened the backpack with trembling hands and pulled out a yellowed envelope. The elegant handwriting on the front of the envelope was unmistakably familiar to Edward, the delicate and artistic script of Helen. "Mrs. Helen is not dead," Yasmin said, her voice echoing among the tombs like a silent thunder. "She is alive. My mother knows where she is." Edward's world seemed to tilt dangerously. The bouquet of flowers slipped from his hands, scattering across the polished marble in an explosion of white petals and sweet perfume. Sophie felt her legs weaken and leaned on her father's arm, both unable to fully process the words they had just heard. "That's impossible," Edward murmured, his voice losing all its usual authority. "Helen was buried here 15 years ago. I organized the funeral myself. I saw the death certificate." Yasmin extended the envelope with unwavering determination. "My mother said you deserved to know the truth. She kept this all these years, waiting for the right moment." Edward took the envelope with hands that trembled imperceptibly. The paper was sealed with red wax, a peculiar habit of Helen's that he had completely forgotten. Inside, he found photographs that made him question his own sanity. The images showed a woman strikingly similar to Helen, but with shorter hair and some lines of expression that hadn't been there 15 years ago. She was surrounded by children in what appeared to be a charity institution or orphanage, smiling with the same sweetness Edward remembered from the early years of their marriage. Where were these photos taken?" Sophie asked, looking over her father's shoulder. "In New Jersey, miss, in a small town called Maplewood. My mother said Mrs. Helen has been taking care of orphan children there for many years." Edward felt the ground disappear beneath his feet. 15 years of mourning, 15 years of weekly visits to that. He stood before the grave, 15 years building his life, around a loss that may have never happened. "Why didn't your mother tell me anything before?" he asked, struggling to maintain composure in front of his daughter. "Because she was fired when she discovered the secret, sir. Mrs. Helen asked her not to tell anyone. Said it was better that way, but my grandmother is sick now, needs surgery, and my mother said it was time for you to know the truth." The silence that followed was interrupted only by the distant chirping of birds and the murmur of New York traffic echoing beyond the walls of Central Park. Edward looked at Helen's grave, then at the photographs in his hands, and finally at the hopeful eyes of Yasmin. His life had just been divided into before and after that moment. Everything he thought he knew about love, loss, and truth was being questioned by a 12-year-old child, carrying secrets capable of either rebuilding or completely destroying his reality. The silence in Edward's office was deafening. The walls lined with mahogany and shelves filled with legal codes seemed to witness the transformation of a man who, just hours before, believed he had absolute control over his own story. Yasmin's photographs were spread across the rosewood table, each image representing a crack in the foundation of 15 years of certainties. Sophie remained seated in the Italian leather armchair, watching her father pace restlessly around the room. Edward had swapped his formal suit for a white linen shirt and dark trousers, yet he still maintained the rigid posture of someone facing $1 billion negotiation. The difference was in his eyes. For the first time in years, they carried a vulnerability she had never witnessed. "Dad, you need to calm down," Sophie said, her voice laden with early maternal concern. "Let's analyze this rationally. It could be an elaborate scam." Edward stopped in front of the panoramic window that offered a privileged view of New York's financial district. The mirrored skyscrapers reflected the orange sky of sunset, creating an urban kaleidoscope that usually calmed him. Today, however, the vastness of the city only amplified his sense of helplessness. "Rational?" Edward murmured, running his hands through his graying hair. "Sophie, this letter." It's impossible to perfectly forge your mother's handwriting. I know every curve, every tilt, Helen wrote, as if she danced on the paper. The office door opened gently, and Mrs. Thompson, the family's housekeeper for over a decade, entered carrying a tray of coffee. Her 60 years were carried with dignity, and her white hair was neatly tied in a bun. Originally from rural Georgia, she had brought not only her domestic efficiency to the New York mansion, but also the wisdom of someone who knew the secrets that great households keep. "Mr. Edward, you haven't touched your lunch," she said with the respectful familiarity of someone who had become part of the family. "And Miss Sophie hasn't eaten properly either." Edward accepted the cup of coffee, inhaling the strong aroma that Mrs. Thompson brewed just as Helen had taught her years ago. This small detail, yet another connection to the past, made his chest tighten painfully. "Mrs. Thompson," Edward said, turning to the housekeeper, "do you remember an employee named Smith? Worked here about 15 years ago." Mrs. Thompson's expression changed subtly. Her brown eyes, always direct and honest, momentarily glanced at the photographs on the table before returning to her employer. "I do, sir. Rachel Smith. She worked here for almost 3 years, she replied carefully. She was a good employee, very dedicated to Mrs. Helen." "Why? Was she fired?" Sophie asked, noticing the hesitation in the housekeeper's voice. Mrs. Thompson placed the tray on the side table and sighed deeply. "Mr. Edward, some things from the past. It might be better to let them sleep." "No!" Edward exclaimed with a vehemence that surprised everyone, including himself. 15 years, Mrs. Thompson. 15 years I visited that grave religiously, carrying a guilt that consumed me inside. If there is a possibility, no matter how small, that Helen is alive." His voice broke on the last word. Mrs. Thompson approached, and with the naturalness of someone who had cared for him during his most difficult moments, placed a maternal hand on his shoulder. "Rachel was fired because she discovered things that Mrs. Helen didn't want anyone to know," she said softly. "I was new here at the time, sir, but I remember she was very disturbed in the last days. She said strange things about Mrs. Helen preparing for a long journey." Sophie abruptly stood up, grabbing one of the photographs. "Mrs. Thompson, take a good look at this woman. Is it possible that it's my mother?" The housekeeper held the photograph with slightly trembling hands. She studied every detail of the image, the curve of the smile, the shape of the eyes, the particular way she tilted her head when she was happy. "My God," she murmured, placing a hand on her chest. "The eyes. The smile. Mr. Edward, this woman looks a lot like Mrs. Helen, very much so." The phone on the table rang sharply, interrupting the moment. Edward answered with the automatic efficiency of an experienced businessman. "Edward Morgan," he said curtly. "Mr. Morgan, this is Robert Adams from the law office. Sir, I need to urgently discuss the Rachel Smith case. She was here today, asking questions about old lawsuits involving your family." Edward felt the blood run cold in his veins. "What kind of questions?" "She wanted to know about the documentation of your wife's burial, sir, and also about the sale of some properties that happened 15 years ago, properties that, according to her, were sold without your knowledge." The call ended in a heavy silence. Edward looked at Sophie and Mrs. Thompson, who were anxiously waiting for explanations. "Properties sold without my knowledge," Edward repeated slowly. "Mrs. Thompson, in the months leading up to, before Helen's death, did you notice any strange behavior, anything different?" Mrs. Thompson hesitated again, clearly struggling between loyalty to her employer and secrets kept for a decade and a half. She finally admitted, "Mrs. Helen was different, yes, more reserved. She spent hours in her office, making calls that she would cut off when someone approached, and she received mail that she would pick up herself from the post office." "What kind of mail?" official envelopes, from banks, notaries, and also from charities. She has always been generous, but in those last months she was donating very large sums. I remember because she asked me never to mention these donations to you. Sophie felt as if she were getting to know a completely new version of her mother. The Helen of her memories was affectionate and present, but apparently there were layers of complexity that a 2-year-old could never comprehend. "Dad," she said softly, "we need to find this Rachel Smith. We need to hear what she has to say." Edward nodded slowly, but his expression revealed the weight of the decision. Seeking the truth meant accepting that everything he had believed for 15 years could be wrong. It meant confronting the possibility that his pain had been based on an elaborate lie. "Mrs. Thompson," he finally said, "I need Rachel's address, and I want to know everything you remember about Helen's last days in this house." As the sun completely set over New York, painting the sky in shades of pink and violet, Edward Morgan prepared to unearth secrets that could either rebuild his life or destroy it forever. The journey toward the truth had begun, and there was no turning back. On the mahogany table, the photographs of a woman who could have been Helen continued to watch them in silence, guardians of mysteries that had waited 15 long years to be revealed. The neighborhood buzzed with the typical energy of New York weekends when Edward and Sophie parked in front of a 2-story brownstone with terracotta-painted walls and small windows protected by white bars. The narrow street, lined with leafy trees filtering the golden afternoon light, contrasted sharply with the opulence of their home in the Upper East Side. Yasmin was waiting for them on the small porch, wearing a simple cotton dress printed with tiny flowers, clearly her best outfit, chosen especially for this meeting. Her eyes sparkled with a mix of anticipation and nervousness as she absent-mindedly played with one of her braids. "My mom is a bit nervous," Yasmin confessed as they approached the wrought-iron gate. "She didn't sleep all night, rearranging and unarranging the living room." Edward felt a tightness in his chest. The vulnerability of the situation, a humble family preparing to host a billionaire in their modest home, stirred within him a compassion he rarely allowed to surface in his business dealings. "There's no reason to be nervous," he said gently, surprising himself with his own kindness. "We just want to talk." The door opened to reveal a woman in her mid-40s, with brown hair tied back in a low ponytail, and eyes that carried the weight of long-held secrets. Rachel Smith wore a navy blue blouse and a dark skirt, clothes she clearly reserved for special occasions. Her hands, calloused from domestic work, trembled slightly as she held the doorknob. "Mr. Edward," she said, her voice choked, making a small bow that he immediately discouraged with a gesture. "Please, Rachel. We are the ones intruding on your home. Thank you for having us." The interior of the brownstone was impeccably clean and organized. The small living room was decorated with simple but well-kept furniture, and the walls displayed family photographs and some hand-stitched religious-themed pictures. The aroma of fresh coffee mingled with the subtle scent of daisies wafting through the open window, a detail that made Edward shudder involuntarily. "Please, have a seat," Rachel said, pointing to the floral-patterned sofa. "Yasmin, go fetch coffee for our guests." Sophie carefully observed every detail of the environment. The honest simplicity of that home contrasted with the palpable tension in the air. Rachel sat in the armchair across from them, keeping her back straight and her hands clasped in her lap. "Rachel," Edward began cautiously, "your daughter showed us some photographs. Photographs that affected me deeply." Rachel sighed deeply, as if she could finally exhale a weight she had carried for decades. "Mr. Edward, for 15 years I have wondered if I did the right thing, if I should have told the truth from the beginning." "What truth?" Sophie asked, leaning forward. The truth about what really happened to your mother in the last months before she left. Yasmin returned with a tray containing coffee cups and a plate of homemade cookies. The girl served with the seriousness of an adult, clearly aware of the importance of the moment. Rachel took a shoebox from the shelf and placed it on the coffee table. Inside, Edward glimpsed letters, photographs, and other carefully preserved documents. Mrs. Helen started to act differently about 6 months before. What everyone thought was her death, Rachel said, pulling a letter from the box. She would spend hours locked in her office, making whispered phone calls. And she started asking me strange questions. What kind of questions? Edward felt his mouth go dry. Questions about my family, about my life before working in the mansion. She wanted to know if I had relatives in other states, if I knew of charities, if I knew how a person could start over in another place. Sophie and Edward exchanged looks loaded with meaning. The image of Helen they knew, a devoted wife and loving mother, was gradually being replaced by someone much more complex and mysterious. One day, Rachel continued, her voice gaining strength, she called me into the office and said she needed my help with something very important, that it was a matter of life or death, but that I couldn't tell anyone, especially not Sir Edward. Life or death, Edward repeated, feeling a chill in his stomach. Rachel pulled a sealed envelope from the box with red wax, identical to the one Yasmin had shown at the Central Park. She said she was sick, Mr. Edward, but not physically. She said her mind was, fragmenting. The silence that followed was heavy as lead. Edward felt as if the air had been sucked out of the room. Helen told me that sometimes she didn't recognize her own reflection in the mirror, Rachel continued, tears beginning to shimmer in her eyes. That she would wake up not remembering where she was or who she was. That she was afraid of hurting you all unintentionally. But she never showed, Edward began, but stopped. Fragmented memories began to reorganize in his mind. Nights when he would wake up and find Helen standing in front of the bathroom mirror, whispering to herself. Mornings when she would look at him with a momentarily empty expression before smiling and pretending everything was normal. She was very good at hiding, sir, Rachel said softly. But with me, she opened up because she needed help. She wanted to disappear in a way that seemed natural, so you all could move on without being tied to someone who was losing herself. Sophie brought her hands to her face, fighting back tears. Did she plan everything? She planned it months in advance, Rachel confirmed. She sold jewelry, transferred money, contacted an institution in New Jersey that cared for orphan children. She said she wanted to dedicate what remained of her lucid mind to caring for those in need. Edward abruptly stood up and walked to the window, unable to remain seated. The revelation was both devastating and strangely comforting. Helen hadn't died abandoning them. She had left to protect them. How did she manage to forge her own death? He asked in a hoarse voice. She knew people, sir. People who owed favors to the family. An old doctor, a clerk. It wasn't hard for someone with Mrs. Helen's resources to make the documents appear. Yasmin, who had remained silent until then, approached her father and whispered something in his ear. Rachel nodded and pulled a more recent photograph from the box. This was taken 2 months ago, she said, handing the image to Edward. Yasmin and I went to visit her. She didn't recognize us, but there was something in her eyes, as if a small part still remembered. The photograph showed Helen, there was no doubt, surrounded by children in a sunny yard. Her hair was shorter and grayer, her face bore the lines of a life lived with purpose, but the smile was unmistakably the same one Edward had fallen in love with 20 years earlier. "Where exactly is she?" Sophie asked, holding the photograph with trembling hands. "In a small town called Maplewood in New Jersey. She..." Runs an orphanage called Hope Home. The children know her as Aunt Helen." Edward returned to the sofa and sat heavily. 15 years of his life had been based on a lie crafted out of love. Helen had sacrificed her own identity to protect the family from the pain of watching her mentally disintegrate. "Mr. Edward," Rachel said hesitantly, "there is something more you need to know. Something about why she really had to leave." Edward looked at her, bracing himself for yet another revelation that could shake the foundations of everything he believed. The atmosphere in the small room became even denser as Rachel hesitated, clearly struggling with the decision to reveal what she had kept hidden for so long. Her hands trembled as she picked up another envelope from the box, this one visibly older and more worn than the others. "Mr. Edward," she said in a voice barely above a whisper, "what I'm about to tell you will be very difficult to hear, but Mrs. Helen made me promise that if this moment ever came, I would tell the whole truth." Edward felt his chest tighten. Sophie moved closer to him on the sofa, instinctively seeking support. In the face of the emotional storm that loomed, Mrs. Helen's mental illness was not natural, Rachel continued, avoiding direct eye contact. It was caused by medication that someone was mixing into her food. The silence that followed was absolute. Even the sounds from the street seemed to hush, as if the world itself was waiting for the continuation of that devastating revelation. "That's impossible," Edward murmured, but his voice lacked conviction. Who would do such a thing and why? Rachel opened the old envelope and pulled out several small photographs, the kind that were common in instant cameras. Of the time, the images showed bottles of medication, handwritten notes, and even a blurry photo of someone tampering with a cup of tea. Mrs. Helen began to suspect when she noticed that the episodes of mental confusion always happened after meals, Rachel explained. She started pretending to drink the afternoon teas, but actually poured them into plant pots. That was when she began to feel better and think more clearly. Sophie picked up one of the photographs with trembling hands. My God, who was doing this to her? Rachel exchanged a significant glance with Yasmin before continuing. It was someone very close to the family, someone who had total access to the house and Mrs. Helen's meals. Edward felt as if the ground was opening beneath his feet. His mind raced through all the people who had intimate access to the family routine 15 years ago. The domestic staff, some close relatives, business partners who frequented the house. "Rachel, for God's sake, tell me who it was," Edward pleaded, standing up again and pacing nervously around the room. "It was your brother, sir, Dr. Richard Morgan." The words hit Edward like a punch to the stomach. He leaned against the wall, feeling his legs weaken. Richard, his younger brother, a respected doctor, partner in the family business, godfather to Sophie, the man who had comforted him during Helen's funeral and had been a pillar of support. During the most difficult years of mourning, support was crucial. "No, this can't be true," Edward whispered, his voice barely audible. "Mrs. Helen discovered everything by accident," Rachel continued, tears streaming down her face. "She found fake medical prescriptions in Dr. Richard's office, psychiatric medications prescribed in her name, but she had never officially taken them. When she confronted him—" "What happened when she confronted him?" asked Sophie, her voice carrying a maturity that she shouldn't possess at 17. "He threatened to hurt both of you if she told anyone. He said that if she tried to expose him, he would ensure that you, Edward, would lose custody of Sophie and end up in prison for a fabricated crime." Edward let himself fall heavily into the armchair that Rachel had occupied. Memories began to reorganize in his mind like pieces of a macabre puzzle. Richard always insisting that Helen take special vitamins because she appeared tired. Richard offering to personally prepare. His sister-in-law's relaxing teas. Richard suggesting that Helen might need psychiatric help when she started to act differently. "Why would he do this?" Edward asked, his voice heavy with pain and disbelief. Jasmine, who had remained silent, finally spoke. "Because of the inheritance, Mr. Edward. My mother overheard a phone conversation from Dr. Richard. He was in deep financial trouble and needed Mrs. Helen to be declared mentally incompetent to take control of her properties." The final revelation hit Edward like an avalanche. Helen had inherited a considerable fortune from her parents, properties and investments that represented almost half of the family's combined wealth. If she were declared incompetent, Richard, as the family doctor and legal guardian, would have access to those resources. "He was literally driving my wife insane for money," Edward murmured, anger beginning to replace the initial shock. "Mrs. Helen realized she couldn't fight him directly," Rachel said. "Who would believe her word against that of a respected doctor, especially if she was showing signs of mental instability? So she devised a plan to disappear." Sophie abruptly stood up, walking to the window. "She preferred to die for us than to see our family being destroyed from within." "Exactly," Rachel confirmed. "She said that at least this way you would have good memories of her, and Dr. Richard wouldn't get what he wanted, as the inheritance would naturally pass to you, Edward, and then to Sophie." Edward felt waves of fury and sadness alternating within his chest. 15 years believing he had failed to protect his wife from a mysterious illness, when in fact the true enemy had been by his side at every wake, every death anniversary, offering comfort while hiding his monstrous crime. "Where is Richard now?" Edward asked, his voice taking on a dangerous tone. "He still lives in the same house in Manhattan," Rachel replied. "He still practices medicine. Apparently, he has never been investigated for anything." Edward picked up his cell phone, but Rachel gently held his wrist. "Mr. Edward, Mrs. Helen made me promise one more thing. She said that if the truth ever came to light, you should not seek revenge, that she chose peace to protect you, and that any violent confrontation would destroy that peace." Edward looked at Sophie, who was watching the scene with tear-filled eyes but also determination. "Dad," she said softly, "first, let's go to New Jersey. Let's see Mom, then we can decide what to do about Uncle Richard." Jasmine timidly approached Edward. "Sir, my mother has a letter from Mrs. Helen for you, a letter she wrote shortly before she left. She said to deliver it only if we ever told the whole truth." With trembling hands, Edward received the last envelope. On the yellowed paper, he immediately recognized Helen's elegant handwriting. The letter was simply addressed, "To my beloved Edward, when the truth is revealed." Edward held Helen's letter against his chest for long moments, as if he could absorb through the paper all the love and pain it contained. Rachel's small room had transformed into a sanctuary of revelations, where 15 years of lies finally gave way to brutal truth. May I have a moment alone to read it?" Edward asked, his voice choked. Rachel nodded understandingly. "Of course, sir. We'll go to the kitchen to prepare more coffee. Sophie, do you want to come with us?" Sophie hesitated, torn between the desire to give her father privacy and the need to know her mother's last words. Edward sensed his daughter's internal conflict. "Stay, Sophie. You have the right to hear this too," he said, carefully breaking the red seal that had remained intact for a decade and a half. The paper was the same that Helen always used for important correspondence, cream-colored with a slightly rough texture, scented with her favorite gardenia perfume. Even after so long, the aroma still lingered subtly, transporting Edward back to the early years of their marriage. With trembling hands, he unfolded the 3 handwritten pages in small, careful script. Sophie moved closer, sitting beside her father on the sofa, both preparing to hear Helen's voice echo through time. Edward began to read aloud, his voice initially hesitant but gaining strength as Helen's words emerged from the paper. My dear Edward, my eternal love, if you are reading this letter, it means that the truth has finally come to light, and that Rachel has fulfilled the promise she made to me. I hope you can forgive me for the lie I chose to live in the last months of our life together. First, I want you to know that every moment by your side was real. Every smile, every kiss, every word of love, all of it was genuine, even when my mind began to fragment due to the poison Richard poured into my body day after day. Edward had to pause, tears blurring his vision. Sophie. He held her hand, giving her strength to continue. I discovered your brother's betrayal by chance when I found the hidden medication vials in his medical office during a routine visit. At first, I thought it was some mistake. But when I started to piece things together, my memory lapses always after the meals he prepared, his constant suggestions that I needed psychiatric help, his insistence that you admit me. It all became horrifically clear. Edward, my love, Richard wasn't just trying to drive me insane for money. He was trying to destroy me because he found out that I knew about the irregularities in his medical investments. He was siphoning money from charity funds for children's hospitals, using our family's name as collateral for fraudulent schemes. If I reported him, he would lose not only his career, but face years in prison. Edward felt a chill run down his spine. The implications were even worse than he had imagined. Richard wasn't just a greedy brother. He was a criminal who had used the family name to legitimize his frauds. When I confronted Richard with the evidence, he showed me his true face. He threatened not only to kill you, my love, but also to hurt our little Sophie. He said he had contacts in New York's underworld who could make anything look like an accident. At that moment, I realized there was no conventional way out. If I reported him to the authorities, he would carry out his threats before any investigation could take place. If I stayed silent, he would continue poisoning me until I was officially declared incapable. At which point, he would take control of our fortune and eliminate the only witnesses to his crimes. The three of us. Sophie sobbed quietly, beginning to understand the magnitude of the sacrifice her mother had made. The only solution was to disappear convincingly, taking away Richard's access to money and his need to eliminate you. With my death, the inheritance would naturally pass to you, and he would have no more reason to hurt our family. Edward, I chose to preserve your lives by sacrificing my identity. It was the hardest decision I ever made, but also the only one that allowed me to sleep peacefully knowing that you and Sophie would be safe. For the past 15 years, I lived as Helen Santos in a small town called Maplewood, dedicating myself to caring for orphan children who, like me, were forced to reinvent their lives. They gave me purpose and, in a way, a new family to love. But not a single day went by without me thinking of you. I keep hidden photographs of you in my room, Edward. I followed Sophie's growth through local newspaper articles about her academic achievements. I know she has become a brilliant and kind young woman, just as I dreamed she would be. If you decide to look for me, know that the Helen you will find is not exactly the same as the one who left. The years of pretending to be someone else, combined with the residual effects of the medication, have changed something in me. Sometimes I can't access certain memories, and other times I confuse which life is real. But the love I feel for you remains intact, kept deep in my heart, where neither Richard nor time could reach. Edward paused longer, struggling to control the emotion that threatened to overwhelm him completely. As for Richard, my love, I ask that you do not seek violent revenge. The evidence I left with Rachel is enough to destroy him legally, but any direct confrontation would put you at risk. He is a desperate man, and desperate men are dangerous. Instead, use the intelligence and patience that I have always admired in you. Turn the evidence over to the proper authorities, but do it when you are safe, far from his reach. Sophie, my precious girl, if you are hearing this, I want you to know that you were the light that brightened my darkest days. Every sacrifice I made was worth it to ensure that you grew up free and safe. Be strong, be kind, and always remember that your mother loves you more than life itself. Edward, if you decide to seek me out, know that our story doesn't have to end as it began. Perhaps we can write a new chapter, different from what we were, but united by the love that has endured 15 years of separation and lies. Forever yours, Helen. The silence that followed the reading of the letter was deep and sacred. Edward carefully folded the paper as if it were a priceless treasure. Sophie cried silently, but there was also a smile on her lips. Her mother had not abandoned the family out of a lack of love, but had sacrificed everything for love. Rachel and Jasmine returned from the kitchen, carrying a new tray of coffee, but immediately sensing that something fundamental had changed in the atmosphere of the room. "We're going to New Jersey," Edward finally said, his voice heavy with determination and hope. "We're bringing Helen home." The road winding between New York and New Jersey had never seemed so long to Edward. Behind the wheel of his armored BMW, he drove in contemplative silence, accompanied by Sophie in the passenger seat and Jasmine and Rachel in the back seat. The rural landscape gradually replaced the urban concrete, with lush fields and gentle hills, painting a bucolic scene that contrasted dramatically with the emotional tension inside the vehicle. Sophie watched her father's concentrated profile, noticing how his fingers nervously drummed on the steering wheel, a habit he had developed in moments of heightened anxiety. She herself felt a mix of anticipation and fear. What would it be like to reunite with a mother she barely remembered, who had become a stranger by her own choice? "Mr. Edward," Rachel said softly, breaking the silence that had persisted for miles. "I need to prepare you for what you will find. The Helen now, she is different, quieter, more cautious with strangers, and sometimes she doesn't recognize people, even those who have visited the orphanage several times." "But is she happy there?" Sophie asked, turning around. "Does that mean she seems fulfilled with the work she does?" Jasmine smiled for the first time in days. "Oh, yes. Aunt Helen is loved by all the children. She sings lullabies in various languages, tells stories she makes up on the spot, and always knows exactly what each child needs to hear when they're sad." Edward felt a tightness in his chest. Helen had always had that natural gift with children. It was one of the reasons they had dreamed of having a large family before fertility issues limited their possibilities to Sophie. "Does she still like daisies?" Edward asked, recalling the scent he had always associated with his wife. "She planted a small herb and flower garden at the orphanage," Rachel replied. "And yes, the daisies are there. She always picks the flowers to decorate the children's dining room." The town of Maplewood emerged among the hills, like a delicate watercolor, with its red-tiled houses and tree-lined streets that preserved the charm of rural New Jersey. The town center buzzed with the typical activity of a Saturday afternoon. Families strolling through the squares, children playing in the parks, and elderly people chatting on benches under the leafy almond trees. "The orphanage is over there," Jasmine pointed, indicating a large building atop a gentle hill surrounded by colorful gardens and a low white picket fence. Edward parked at the entrance of Hope Home, his hands trembling slightly as he turned off the engine. The establishment radiated warmth. It was an adapted colonial house, with wide porches filled with colorful hammocks and plant pots creating small oases of green and flowers. "Take a deep breath," Sophie murmured, more to herself than to the others. "After 15 years, we're finally going to see her." Rachel led the small group through the entrance gate, where they were greeted by a young woman of about 30, with curly hair tied up. In a high bun and a colorful apron over a simple dress, "Rachel, what a nice surprise," the young woman said, hugging the visitor. "And you brought friends?" "Carmem, these are special friends of Aunt Helen. They would love to see the work she does here." Carmem looked curiously at Edward and Sophie, clearly impressed by the understated elegance of their clothes and the striking presence they exuded. "Of course. Aunt Helen is in the backyard, organizing a theater presentation with the older children. You arrived at a good time." As they walked through the corridors of the orphanage, Edward absorbed every detail. The walls were decorated with colorful children's drawings, photographs of festivities, and small shelves filled with well-preserved books. The aroma was of cleanliness, fresh flowers, and something indefinable that only places filled with love possess. "How many children live here?" Sophie asked. "We currently have 42. Carmen replied proudly, "from babies just a few months old to teenagers of 17. Aunt Helen manages to connect with all of them, regardless of age or the stories they bring." The sound of children's laughter and a female voice telling a story guided them to a wide porch that overlooked a sunny yard, and there she was, Helen. Edward felt as if time had completely stopped. She was sitting in a low chair, surrounded by about 15 children of various ages, all paying absolute attention to the story she was narrating with expressive gestures. Her hair, now streaked with grey, was tied up in a loose bun. She wore a simple floral cotton dress and flat sandals. Some delicate wrinkles marked her eyes, but the smile was exactly the same as Edward remembered from his most precious memories. And then the dragon realized that it didn't need to be fierce to be respected, Helen said with the melodious voice Edward had known and loved. It just needed to be kind and use its strength to protect, not to scare. A little girl, perhaps 5 years old, raised her hand. "Aunt Helen, can all dragons learn to be nice?" Helen smiled, stroking the girl's hair. "We can all learn to be better, dear. Sometimes we just need someone who believes in us." It was at that moment that Helen looked up and saw the small group watching from the porch. Her gaze passed over Rachel and Jasmine with familiarity, but when it settled on Edward and Sophie, something changed in her expression. There was no immediate recognition, but something more subtle, a restlessness, as if a distant memory was trying to emerge from the depths of her fragmented consciousness. "Children," Helen said softly, "how about playing in the playground for a moment? Aunt Helen needs to talk to these visitors." The children obediently dispersed, but not before each received a gentle touch or sweet word from Helen. Edward watched, fascinated, as she managed to make each child feel special with a simple gesture. Helen approached slowly, her hands clasped, in front of her body in a slightly defensive posture. When she was just a few meters away, she stopped and tilted her head, studying the faces of Edward and Sophie with the intensity of someone trying to solve a complex puzzle. "Do I know you?" she asked, her voice laden with a vulnerability that broke Edward's heart into 1,000 pieces. Sophie stepped forward, tears silently streaming down her face. "Mom," she whispered, the word coming out like a prayer. Helen placed a hand on her chest, her eyes widening. "Mom," she repeated as if the word were in a foreign language she barely understood, but that awakened deep echoes in her soul. Edward, gathering all his courage, took a step forward. "Helen," he said simply, carrying 15 years of longing in a single word. Helen remained motionless for long moments, her green eyes scanning every detail of Edward and Sophie's faces, as if trying to decipher an ancient code etched in her deepest memory. Her hands trembled slightly, and she pressed them against her chest, where her heart beat irregularly. "Helen," Edward repeated softly, taking another cautious step in her direction. "Helen, I am Edward." The name echoed in the air like a stone thrown into a calm lake, creating waves of recognition that gradually spread across Helen's face. Her legs buckled, and she leaned against the chair where moments before she had been telling stories to the children. "Edward," she murmured, the word escaping as a whisper laden with disbelief. "No, it can't be. I died for you. I must be dead to you." Sophie gasped loudly, covering her mouth with her hands. The pain in Helen's voice was palpable, revealing the internal conflict between the love she had kept hidden and the fear of the consequences of his return. Carmen, sensing the emotional intensity of the moment, discreetly ushered the curious children away, creating a circle of privacy around the group. "Helen," Edward said, his voice choked, "we know the truth. We know about Richard, about the medications, about everything. You don't need to hide any more." Upon hearing the name Richard, Helen instinctively recoiled, her eyes widening in panic. "No, don't say that name. He might be listening. He said he would find me wherever I went." Rachel approached calmly, recognizing the signs of an anxiety episode that sometimes still afflicted Helen. "Aunt Helen, look at me. You are safe here. Dr. Richard doesn't know where you are. He never did." Helen focused her gaze on Rachel, using her as an anchor to stay present. She took a few deep breaths, a technique she had clearly learned over the years to manage moments of panic. How did you find me?" Helen asked, addressing Edward and Sophie, but keeping a safe distance. "Your daughter," Edward replied, gently pointing to Jasmine. "Jasmine told us about the letters, about the photographs. She wanted us to know the truth." Helen looked at Jasmine with a mixture of surprise and tenderness. "Jasmine, my dear, you shouldn't have. It was dangerous." "It's not dangerous anymore, Aunt Helen," Jasmine said, with the determination she inherited from her mother. "My mum kept your secrets for 15 years, but now it's time for your true family to meet you." Sophie, gathering courage, took a few more steps toward Helen. "I know you don't remember me. I was only 2 when you left, but I dreamed of you every night. I dreamed that you would come home." Tears began to stream down Helen's face. She hesitantly reached a hand toward Sophie's face, stopping just inches away, as if fearing that the touch might break a delicate spell. "Your eyes," Helen whispered, "are just like mine. And you have the same face shape I had at your age." "I have photographs of you," Sophie said softly. "I've studied each one thousands of times. You taught me to walk, even though I don't remember. You sang lullabies in Italian because you said it was the most beautiful language in the world." Something broke inside Helen. An emotional dam she had carefully constructed over 15 years crumbled all at once, and she began to cry, not just tears, but deep sobs that seemed to emerge from the center of her soul. "My bambina," she murmured in Italian, the memory surfacing spontaneously. "My piccola Sophie." Edward felt his own defenses crumble. Seeing Helen remember her daughter, even if only in fragments, awakened a hope he had buried long ago. "Helen," he said, taking another step closer, "do you remember our garden? The daisies you planted? They still bloom every year as if waiting for your return." Helen looked at Edward with tear-filled eyes, but also with a sweetness he hadn't seen in decades. "The daisies. Yes, I remember. You said their scent would follow me wherever I went." "And it has," Edward said, pulling a small fabric sachet from his pocket. "I brought fresh flowers from our garden." He gently opened the sachet, releasing the unmistakable aroma of daisies. Helen closed her eyes and inhaled deeply, and for a magical moment the years disappeared. She was back in the mansion in New York, in her husband's arms, planning the future with her little daughter. "Edward," she said, opening her eyes and looking directly at him for the first time since their reunion. Do you still love me? After everything I've done? After lying? After faking my death?" Edward could no longer maintain the distance. He crossed the few meters that separated them and gently took Helen's hands in his. "Helen, I never stopped loving you. Not for a day, not for a minute. You did what you did to protect us, to save our family. How could I not love you for that?" Sophie stepped closer as well, forming a small, intimate circle. "Mom, we want you to come home. If you want to, if you can." Helen looked at the two people she had loved more than life itself, then at the children playing in the yard under Carmen's care, and finally at Rachel and Jasmine, who had made this impossible moment possible. I don't know if I can be the same Helen you remember," she said hesitantly. "These 15 years have changed me. Sometimes I still get confused. I still have nightmares about Richard. And these children, they depend on me." "We don't want you to be the same," Edward said firmly. "We want to know who you are now, and as for the children, we will find a way to continue supporting the work you do here." Helen smiled through her tears, the first genuine smile Edward had seen in 15 years. You have all grown so much. Edward, you have grey hair now. Sophie, you have become a beautiful woman. And you," Sophie said, "have become exactly the kind of person I always wanted my mum to be. Someone who dedicates her life to caring for those in need." At that moment, one of the smaller children, a little boy of perhaps 4 years, ran toward Helen and clung to her skirt. "Aunt Helen, are these your special friends?" he asked, looking curiously at Edward and Sophie. Helen stroked the boy's hair, then looked at her reunited family. "Yes, little John, these are my family." The word family echoed in the air like a promise of new beginnings, of possible healing, of loves that survive even simulated death and 15 years of forced separation. The evening in Maplewood painted the sky in shades of orange and violet, creating a magical atmosphere over the orphanage. Helen had invited Edward and Sophie to dinner in the children's dining hall, an experience that would forever change their perception of the new life she had built. The large rustic wooden table was set with simple yet colourful plates, and the aroma of homemade chili filled the air. 42 children of various ages settled around the tables, creating a symphony of animated conversations and laughter that echoed off the walls, decorated with children's drawings. "Aunt Helen," said a girl of about 8, with braids adorned with colourful ribbons, "is that elegant man really your husband?" Helen blushed slightly, exchanging a shy glance with Edward. "Anna Beatrice, these are very special friends of Aunt Helen, Mr. Edward and Miss Sophie. But he looks at you the same way Maria's dad looks at her mom when he comes to pick her up on weekends," the girl insisted with the brutal honesty typical of children. Edward smiled, feeling curiously at ease in this chaotic and loving environment. "Anna Beatrice, you are very observant. Yes, I've known Aunt Helen for a very, very long time." Sophie was fascinated watching how Helen interacted with the children. She moved among them naturally, cutting the food of the smaller ones, mediating small disputes, comforting those who were sad, all with infinite patience and a genuine love that radiated from every gesture. "Mom," Sophie said softly during a moment when Helen was helping a smaller child, "you are amazing with them. It's like you were born for this." "They saved me," Helen replied simply. "When I got here, I was lost, confused, not knowing who I really was. These children gave me purpose again. They taught me that love is not remembered, it is felt." Edward watched the dynamic with growing admiration. Helen had found a way to channel her wounded maternal instinct into dozens of children who desperately needed love. It was simultaneously inspiring and devastating to see how she had transformed her pain into care. After dinner, as the children prepared for story time before bed, Helen took Edward and Sophie for a walk through the orphanage gardens. The moonlight gently illuminated the flower beds and medicinal herbs she had planted over the years. "This is my favorite place," Helen said, stopping in front of a small grove of almond trees. "I planted them in the second year I was here. Every spring, when they bloom, I remember you." Edward approached one of the trees, gently touching the leaves. "Helen, I need to tell you about Richard." Helen stiffened instantly, her eyes filling with the same panic Edward had seen earlier. He found out where I am?" "No, love. He doesn't know anything," Edward said quickly, using the endearing term without thinking. "But we have enough evidence to take him down legally. The proof you left with Rachel, combined with a proper investigation—" "No!" Helen exclaimed with a vehemence that surprised them both. "Edward, you don't understand. Richard is not just an ordinary criminal. He has dangerous connections, people who will do anything for money. If you try to expose him—" "Then what do you suggest?" Sophie asked. "That we let him remain free, knowing what he did to you?" Helen walked over to a wooden bench under an almond tree and sat heavily. "For 15 years I lived in fear that he would find out where I am, but I also lived with the peace of knowing that you were safe. If we stir this up now—" Edward sat beside her, keeping a respectful yet comforting distance. "Helen, we can't live forever in fear of him, and you deserve justice." "Justice?" Helen laughed bitterly. "Edward, look around. I have 42 children who— Call me Mom. I have a job that fulfills me completely. I have peace. Isn't that justice enough?" Sophie knelt before her mother, gently taking her hands. "Mom, you can have all that and still go home. You can have this family and also your original family." "How?" Helen asked, tears shining in her eyes. "Sophie, I don't even know who I really am anymore. Helen Morgan died 15 years ago. Helen Smith is who I am now. How can I be both?" Edward turned fully to her, facing the question he had avoided asking since their reunion. "Helen, the most important question is, do you want to go back? Not to what you were before, but to who we are now." Helen remained silent for long moments, gazing at the stars that began to dot the New Jersey sky. "Edward, I never stopped loving you. Not for a day. But I also love these children, this life I have built. How do I choose between two loves?" "Maybe you don't have to choose," a soft voice said from behind them. They turned to see Carmen approaching, carrying an envelope in her hands. "Sorry to interrupt," she said, but "This arrived for Aunt Helen today. It's from the City Hall." Helen opened the envelope with trembling hands and quickly read its contents. Her expression gradually changed from curiosity to surprise, and then to something that could be hope. "What is it?" Edward asked. "The City Hall is offering a larger plot of land for us to expand the orphanage," Helen said. Her voice, a heavy emotional tone, Edward said. "They want to create a center for the care of orphaned children throughout the state. But we need investors, people with administrative experience." Edward and Sophie exchanged a meaningful glance. "Helen," Edward said slowly, "what if it's not about choosing between two lives? What if it's about creating a third option?" "What do you mean?" "I could move my headquarters to Maplewood," Edward said, ideas forming as he spoke. "It would be just a few hours from here. Sophie could study medicine at UMDNJ, one of the best universities in the country, and the three of us could work together to make this place something even greater." Helen looked at him with wide eyes. You would do that? Leave New York? Your company? Your life there?" "Helen," Edward said firmly, "my life is where you are. It always has been. These 15 years have just been a forced pause." Sophie held her mother's hands more tightly. "Mom, we can build something new together. You don't have to go back to who you were. We can become who we should be. Helen looked at the orphanage softly illuminated by the windows, where the children were likely getting ready for bed. Then she looked at Edward and Sophie, who represented a beloved past and a possible future. You would really do this, rebuild your lives here, for me? Not for you, Edward said gently, for us, as a family. Helen smiled through her tears, not the fragmented smile of someone struggling against lost memories, but the full smile of someone glimpsing a second chance at happiness. Then yes, she said, her voice gaining strength and certainty. Yes, I want to try. I want to try to be Helen Morgan Smith. I want to be Sophie's mother and Edward's wife, but also a mother to all these children. In that moment, under the New Jersey stars and the scent of blooming daisies, a family came together again, not as it was before, but as it could be now. Continue trying again. Chapter 9. The Final Confrontation. 3 months after the reunion in New Jersey, Edward had established a temporary office in Maplewood and started the gradual process of transferring his business. Sophie was preparing for the medical school entrance exam at UMDNJ, and Helen was dividing her time between the orphanage and therapy sessions in New York, working to integrate her two identities in a healthy way. The family had decided to keep Helen's return a secret until they could properly deal with Richard. But that Thursday morning, while Edward was reviewing contracts in his new office, a phone call would change everything. "Mr. Edward," said Conceiçon's tense voice on the phone, "Dr. Richard is here. He showed up unannounced and is asking questions about where you've been for the past few months. He's very nervous, sir, very aggressive." Edward felt his blood run cold. "Conceiçon, don't tell him anything. Tell him I'm traveling for business, and call security discreetly." "Sir, he brought a man with him. A man who doesn't seem like the kind of person Dr. Richard usually associates with." Edward understood immediately. Richard was feeling threatened and had brought protection, or worse, he had brought someone to intimidate. "Conceiçon, leave the house immediately. Go to your sister's house and stay there until I call. That's an order." Edward hung up and immediately called Helen at the orphanage. "Love, Richard is moving. It seems he suspects something." "Edward, you promised you wouldn't do anything dangerous," Helen said, her voice heavy with panic. "Please, come here. Let's leave. Let's go somewhere else." "No, Helen, enough. 15 years is long enough to run. It's time to end this." Edward made a few more strategic calls, to his lawyer, to a private investigator he had discreetly hired, and to an investigative journalist who had been following medical fraud cases in New York. 2 hours later, Edward was driving back to New York, accompanied by Sophie, who had insisted on being present for the final confrontation. "Dad, are you sure it's safe?" Sophie asked as they approached the family mansion. "Safe for whom?" Edward replied with a smile that didn't reach his eyes. "For us or for Richard?" The mansion was silent when they arrived. Edward immediately noticed an unfamiliar black car parked at the entrance, a vehicle with tinted windows that confirmed his suspicions about the kind of company Richard had brought. "Sophie, you stay in the car," Edward said firmly. "No way. We do this together, remember?" Edward sighed, recognizing the iron determination that Sophie had inherited from both him and Helen. "Then stay behind me at all times." They entered through the front door, finding Richard comfortably seated in the leather armchair of the living room. At 50, Edward's younger brother maintained his usual impeccable appearance. Expensive suit, perfectly styled hair, confident posture. But his eyes revealed a tension that Edward had never seen before. Beside Richard was a man in his 40s whose appearance screamed expensive bodyguard, watching Edward with calculating eyes. "Edward," Richard said, rising with a smile that didn't disguise the tension. "What a surprise! Where have you been these past few months?" Conceição said you were traveling, but your associates told me you cancelled several important meetings. Richard, Edward replied dryly, what an unexpected pleasure. I didn't know you still had keys to this house. I'm your brother, Edward. I've always been welcome here. Richard gestured vaguely to the man beside him. This is Mr. Anthony, my security consultant. Edward nodded coldly to Anthony, who remained motionless like a statue. Security consultant? For what, Richard? Are you feeling threatened for some reason? The question hit its mark. Richard hesitated for a fraction of a second before regaining his composure. Edward, I need to talk to you about some irregularities that have come up in the family business. It seems someone has been investigating old transactions, digging into issues. What should remain buried? What kind of questions? Edward approached slowly, his hands relaxed, but ready to react if necessary. Questions related to the time of Helen's death. Questions that could cause unnecessary embarrassment for our family. Sophie stepped forward, unable to contain her anger any longer. Embarrassment? Is that what you call trying to drive my mother insane with medication? The silence that followed was deafening. Richard visibly paled, his eyes darting quickly between Edward and Sophie. Antonio straightened up, clearly preparing for an escalation of the situation. I don't know what you're talking about, Richard said slowly, but his voice betrayed nervousness. Edward smiled coldly. Richard, did you really think you could keep your secrets forever? At that moment, the door to the room opened softly, and Helen entered, followed by Rachel and Jasmine. Edward had carefully orchestrated everything. Helen had arrived through a side entrance, accompanied by the only living witnesses to Richard's crimes. Richard stood up abruptly, his chair falling backward with a loud thud. His face went through a rapid sequence of emotions: shock, terror, disbelief, and finally desperate fury. Impossible, he murmured, leaning against the coffee table. You're dead. I organized. You organized a farce, Helen said calmly, though her hands trembled slightly. A farce to hide your crimes. Richard quickly glanced at Antonio, who made a subtle move toward his jacket, but Edward was prepared. Antonio, I wouldn't do that if I were you, Edward said, discreetly pulling out his phone. This call connects directly to the federal police. 1 touch and 5 squad cars will be here in 3 minutes. And there's one more thing, Sophie added, surprising everyone with her calmness. Everything happening here is being streamed live to 3 different journalists, including a medical fraud expert. Richard looked around the room, finally realizing he was completely cornered. 15 years of secrets were crumbling in a matter of minutes. Helen, he said pleadingly, trying one last gambit. You don't understand. I was trying to help you. You were becoming unstable. You needed treatment. Lies! Rachel exploded, speaking for the first time. I saw you tampering with her food. I saw the medications. You were trying to destroy her mind, to steal her inheritance. Antonio whispered something in Richard's ear, clearly advising him on his limited options. Richard, Edward finally said, you have a choice. You can voluntarily surrender and cooperate with the investigations into the other frauds we've uncovered. Yes, we know about the embezzlement of charity funds too. Or you can try to flee and face a nationwide manhunt. Richard looked at Helen one last time, and in his eyes was something that could have been remorse. Helen, I never wanted it to come to this. It has, Helen simply said. And now it's time for you to pay for what you've done. The sound of approaching sirens echoed through the New York morning, sealing Richard Morgan's fate and ending 15 years of lies, fear, and forced separation. A year after the confrontation that changed their lives forever, Edward was in the garden of the new headquarters of Hope home in Maplewood, watching dozens of workers putting the finishing touches on the impressive expansion of the orphanage. What was once an adapted colonial house had transformed into a modern complex of 3 pavilions, capable of housing over 100 children and offering innovative educational programs. "Dad, the inauguration ceremony is ready," Sophie said, approaching him wearing the white coat of a medical student. At 18, she radiated a serene confidence forged by the challenges she had overcome in the past year. "Mom is finishing organizing the children for the presentation." Edward smiled, adjusting the tie of the dark suit he had chosen for the special occasion. The successful businessman from New York had surprisingly adapted well to life in suburban New Jersey, discovering that his administrative talents were even more valuable when applied to a cause that touched his heart deeply. "How is Helen?" Edward asked, using his wife's full name, a conscious choice they had made together. She was no longer just Helen Smith from the orphanage, nor the Helen Morgan of before. She was a new version of herself, integrating both identities with the help of careful therapy and a lot of love. "Radiant," Sophie replied. "You should see her with the new children who arrived this week. It's as if she was born for this." Indeed, Helen had flourished in the past year in ways that surprised even the therapists who worked with her. The integration of her fragmented memories had been facilitated by the emotional stability of being with family again, combined with the purpose she found in caring for the children. Richard's trial had ended 6 months earlier, resulting in a 12-year prison sentence for multiple counts of fraud, forgery, and attempted poisoning. The investigations revealed a complex network of financial crimes involving charity funds, which Richard had used to sustain an extravagant lifestyle and cover gambling debts. During the trial, Helen had testified with a courage that impressed everyone present. Her final statement, where she forgave her brother-in-law but affirmed the importance of justice, had been reproduced in national newspapers as an example of dignity in the face of adversity. "Mr. Edward!" shouted a familiar little voice. It was John, now 5 years old, running towards him with a drawing in hand. "Look what I made for you." Edward knelt to be at the boy's height, carefully examining the drawing that showed a colorful house surrounded by figures representing a large family. "It's beautiful, John. Can you tell me who these people are?" "This here is Aunt Helen, this is you, this is Sophie, and these others are all the kids from our big family," John said proudly. "And look, I put the daisies that Aunt Helen loves so much." Edward felt his chest tighten with emotion. Those children had genuinely become part of his family, and he had discovered a paternal side he never knew he possessed. "John, this is the most beautiful drawing I've ever seen. I'm going to frame it and put it in my office." "Promise?" "I promise." Soft music began to play in the main courtyard, signaling the start of the ceremony. Edward made his way to the makeshift stage where Helen awaited him, radiant in a navy blue dress that accentuated her green eyes. Her hair, now with grey streaks she had decided to keep natural, was styled in an elegant bun adorned with fresh daisies. The audience was a fascinating mix of local authorities, business people Edward had convinced to support the project, families from the community, and, most importantly, dozens of children dressed in their best clothes for the special occasion. "Friends," Edward began into the microphone, his voice echoing through the courtyard, "a year and a half ago, I thought I knew the meaning of family. I thought success was measured only in numbers and financial achievements. Today, surrounded by these extraordinary children and the work my wife Helen has built here, I realize I was deeply mistaken." Warm applause echoed through the courtyard. Helen stepped up to the microphone, her presence commanding respect and attention. "When I arrived in Maplewood 16 years ago," she said, her voice clear and confident. I was lost. I had lost my identity, my family, my own sanity. These children saved me, gave me purpose when I had nothing left. She paused, searching for Edward and Sophie in the crowd before continuing. Today, we inaugurate not just a physical expansion of this orphanage, but a new philosophy of care. Here, we do not just care for orphaned children. We create families, families that extend beyond blood ties, based on love, mutual care, and the belief that every child deserves not just a roof over their head, but a true home. Sophie joined her parents on stage, carrying an official certificate. On behalf of the Morgan Smith Foundation, she said, "It is with immense pleasure that I announce that Hope Home will become the first reference center for alternative family care in New Jersey, serving as a model for similar institutions across the country." The children erupted in celebration, some crying tears of joy, others running to hug Helen and Edward. The moment was simultaneously chaotic and deeply touching. Later that day, when the last guests had departed and the children were sleeping, Edward, Helen, and Sophie sat on the porch of the main house, gazing at the stars, shining brightly in the clear night sky. "Do you have any regrets?" Edward asked, Helen gently taking her hand. Helen smiled, intertwining her fingers with his. "Regrets? Edward, these have been the hardest and most rewarding years of my life. If I could go back in time, I would change many things, especially the pain you all felt. But I wouldn't change the path that brought me here." "And you, Sophie?" Edward asked. "Do you miss life in New York?" Sophie chuckled softly. "Dad, in New York I had everything money could buy. But here I have something priceless, a true family and a purpose. When I graduate in medicine, I want to specialize in pediatrics and work right here." Edward looked at the two women who were the center of his universe, then at the softly lit complex, where over 100 children slept safely, loved and cared for. "You know," he said thoughtfully, "for 15 years I visited Helen's grave every week, carrying a terrible guilt for not being able to save her. Today I realize she didn't need to be saved. She needed to save. And in the process of saving dozens of children, she ended up saving us too." Helen rested her head on Edward's shoulder, feeling whole in a way she hadn't experienced in decades. "Edward, do you remember what I wrote in those old letters? That true love is not about possessing someone, but wanting their happiness above all?" "I remember. Today I understand that love can also be broader than we imagine. I can love you both with all my heart and still have enough heart to love all these children too." Sophie stood up and kissed her parents on the forehead. "I'm going to check on the children before bed. Good night, Mom. Good night, Dad." As Sophie walked away, Edward and Helen remained in comfortable silence, watching the gentle sway of the almond trees in the night breeze. The scent of the flowers floated in the air, carrying promises of future springs and enduring love. "Helen," Edward said softly, "thank you for teaching me that sometimes we need to die to who we were, to be reborn to who we should be." "Thank you," she replied, "for proving to me that true love can survive anything, even simulated death and 15 years of separation." That night, under the New Jersey stars and surrounded by the love of a family that transcended conventional definitions, Edward and Helen Morgan finally found the peace they had sought for so long, not as they were before, but as they had become. People transformed by pain, strengthened by forgiveness, and united by a love that had proven to be truly eternal.